Good afternoon. Welcome to our fifth lecture in the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics series this year. My name is Larry Lessig. I'm the director of the center and a professor here at the law school. And I'm very happy to welcome tonight Charles Ferguson, the director of the film Inside Job, back to Cambridge, or at least back to this half of Cambridge. For Mr. Ferguson spent much of his life on the other half of Cambridge, earning a PhD in political science from MIT. After a BA in mathematics from Berkeley, I suspect you're the only MIT PhD to win an Academy Award. I'm not sure if that's true, but before he became an award-winning documentary filmmaker, he was a technologist. In 1994, he founded the company Vermeer Technologies, which produced a website development tool known as Front Page, which Microsoft acquired and put inside of Microsoft Office. And that purchase purchased Mr. Ferguson a certain freedom, and then he spent a number of years as a visiting scholar and lecturer at MIT and at Brookings and at Berkeley. Now, Mr. Ferguson's film has a very special place in the life of the Edmund J. Safra Lab. As most of you know, our work is focused on the question of institutional corruption. We think of that most simply as the way in which institutions lose their way, in particular because of improper influences, in particular influences like money. And last year, in the middle of a vicious winter, most of the fellows at the center trundled off one night to Kendall Square to see Mr. Ferguson's film. And while many, of course, find the film most compelling because it told in an incredibly accessible way the story of this financial crisis, we found it compelling because it was the first accessible and incredibly powerful popular presentation of the dynamic that we think we are studying. For the film doesn't simply account for some accounting error, it also looks skeptically at the influence of private money on the profession of economics. Now, in telling this story, Mr. Ferguson has made some enemies. As he is critical of some at this university, some of those enemies are around here, and indeed our inviting him to speak this evening about the experience of telling this story created something of a stir, at least with some of those people. One person said to me, quote, "How can you invite a man to Harvard who so viciously, and some say unfairly, criticized Harvard?" I've got to say I was stunned by the question. I wanted to say, you realize you're speaking in your out loud voice here, right? But instead I said, how could I invite such a man to Harvard who has so strongly criticized Harvard? I think the answer should be because it's Harvard that I can invite him to Harvard. So there will be many who have questions. There will be some who have significant criticism, especially from the building that's about a stone's throw away in this direction. But I'm grateful to you, Charles Ferguson, for stepping off the stage of an Academy Award-winning director to tell the story for us here. So I welcome you to this podium to be our fifth lecturer this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here, and I have to say, by the way, that it was actually, despite the contentious and sometimes grim nature of the subject matter, it was a delight to make Inside Job. It was a hell of a lot of fun to make that movie. Movies are a lot of fun, even when they're about serious things. And I will now take out my one page of notes. So I actually returned for the last 6 months to my policy wonk origins, and literally about 72 hours ago I turned in the manuscript of a book which is going to be published by Random House in late May, and which is about all of this stuff, which turned out to synthesize in some ways that were initially, to me, very unexpected, some of the academic work that I did a long time ago with the work that I did on the financial crisis, with also yet newer work that I did for the book and that I spoke with a lot of other people about. What I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about a few rather large-scale but still specific elements of America's current economic and political condition, and then say something in somewhat more detail about what I think was and in some cases still is going on in these particular arenas, and then say something in conclusion about the ways that these things are actually, I think, susceptible to and very much in need of serious intellectual work as abstract and actually quite deep theoretical questions. So there's a lot of things about the United States economically and politically that I think most serious students of the subject agree on now. The list includes the sharp rise in economic inequality, the concentration of wealth, the increasing influence of money on politics, the various ways that happens. As kind of, and I would say that I take that description of the country's condition as a given, by which I don't mean to say that I think that everything that's happened in the United States over the last 30 years has been bad. Quite the contrary. Many good things have happened in this country. But I'd like to concentrate very specifically on the nation's economic performance and on certain contributors to that economic performance. I'm not going to be describing or attempting to describe everything about what's happened in the country, obviously, but I want to point out and then provide a kind of stylized description of two or three particular important phenomena. And the three that I would list are the declining internal performance of the largest incumbent firms and industries in the United States over the last 35 years. The second would be the financial sector and the financial crisis. And the third, because I'm here and because many people who watched the film found it to be the most surprising or noteworthy aspect of the film, is this question of conflicts of interest in academia and what's happened to the academic system in the United States. So when I was a policy wonk at MIT and then later at Brookings, I looked in considerable detail at several industries, and one of them I ended up writing a book about. I wrote a book about the broadband problem, broadband policy. And I spent quite a lot of time directly looking at and listening to people who'd spent serious time looking at industries including the automobile sector, the steel sector. There was a professor at MIT at the time, I don't know if he's still there, Julian Shikeli, who was a very, very smart guy about what had happened to the American steel industry, in his case from an engineering background. As people here may know, some of the best studies of the performance of the automobile sector were done by people at Harvard and MIT. Professor Salter is here. Kim Clark and a group around him did a huge study of product development in the automobile sector, comparing European, American, Japanese firms. A group at MIT, and my office was next door to theirs, the International Motor Vehicle Program, did this mammoth study of manufacturing performance in the global automobile industry. And I also spent a lot of time looking at and sometimes in high technology. I worked for IBM for a couple of years. I had a brief hallucinatory experience working for Oracle for a while. Working for Larry Ellison, believe me, I could tell you stories. And there was an astounding commonality to what you saw. If you looked at what happened to IBM in the 1970s and 1980s, what happened to General Motors throughout this period, what happened to the American steel industry, there were various details that were different, of course, but every time what you saw was, and here's the kind of very stylized description, what you saw was a company and or an industry that at one point had been an innovator in one or more ways, had been extraordinarily dynamic, powerful, efficient, and where for a long period of time, indeed, people feared the company and or the industry because of its power, because of its efficiency, because of its ability to be controlling and predatory, whether or not it actually was, but that was the view. And then over time, the company and or the industry became extraordinarily inefficient, but was able to maintain its market position for a very long period of time after it was no longer world-class, no longer as efficient as it should have been. And in some cases, the margin of inefficiency in these companies was truly extraordinarily large. The results from both the Kim Clark study and the IMVP study of the automobile industry indicated roughly a 2-to-1 productivity differential between the majority of the Japanese industry and the majority of the American industry for roughly comparable products. And there were some very, very direct comparisons that indicated that that result was real. And in the case of IBM, which had been for quite a period of time an absolutely astonishing company in a variety of ways, very progressive in the 1960s and 70s with regard to the hiring of minorities and women, very progressive in its personnel policies generally, a remarkably global company in a number of ways, not just including its personnel, but in the way that it thought. A remarkable research organization. IBM invented disk drives, relational database systems, many other things, co-invented semiconductor memory, and a number of Nobel Prizes from IBM Research for the scanning tunneling microscope, other things. By the time I worked there, which was the 1980s, the mid-1980s, the price-performance differential between an IBM mainframe, which at the time was the core of IBM's business, and a personal computer sold by Apple or somebody, was about 50-to-1. It was a huge, huge difference. And IBM did nothing about that, or not nearly enough about it. In fact, many of the things that it did were counterproductive. It tried to preserve its mainframe business in the same way that GM overinvested in very large automobiles and trucks. And then eventually, in the case of the technology sector, what saved the United States economy was the fact that the replacements and competitors to IBM were also American, because entry was possible in that industry for small companies, venture capital funded startups, using microprocessors produced by Intel and others, and using software produced by Microsoft and Apple and others. And so in 1993, IBM lost $30 billion in 1 year, which is hard to do, although AIG showed that you could do even better in 2008. And when you looked at what had gone wrong in those companies, what you saw was this gradual pattern of entrenchment of systems and also entrenchment of people. And the degree of what you would call corruption that was involved varied widely, but in very few cases was it literal corruption. I mean, the people who ran IBM in the early 1990s were not corrupt, but they had entrenched themselves, and they had created a system around them with varying degrees of consciousness and deliberate action on their part in doing this. They had created a system around them that let them do their thing and let them continue to have their privileged positions, and that covered up or minimized the long-term problems that the company was facing. And something similar happened with regard to General Motors and very similar things happened in the steel industry. In the steel industry, there was an oligopoly of a half dozen firms. In both the steel and automobile cases, there was also some involvement on the part of the unions, although that was secondary. In the case of the telecommunications industry, which I studied in great detail at one point, it was an industry, this is post-breakup of IBM, of AT&T. AT&T agreed in 1982 to be broken up, was broken up in 1984. Then in 1996, the Clinton administration passed an attempt at a kind of grand bargain in the industry, the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And what happened was that the incumbents, whose heritage had been the regulated monopoly behavior of AT&T, were able, through a remarkable combination of strategic coordination, never competing with each other basically, and lobbying, which really was their core competence. The industry literally spent more money on lobbying and political action of various kinds than it did on R&D, by a considerable fraction. I mean, not a trivial sum. It was a very large amount of money, and still is. And what was an industry that contained, at its peak in the late 1990s, peak in terms of number of firms, was about 14 major firms, most of them leftovers from the regional AT&T operating companies, but there were also long-distance competitors like MCI and so on. And now there's basically two, AT&T and Verizon. They've all merged. And even if you count the cable industry, that adds another 2 or 3. And they have begun to cooperate in various ways. They've just begun signing cross-marketing agreements. And so it is, to me, not a surprise to therefore observe that broadband price performance in the United States is a factor of 5 to a factor of 20 behind many other countries. You know, if you go to Taiwan or Singapore or Japan, Scandinavia also, you see vastly superior, Korea, vastly superior price performance for broadband services, which one would think, would be a very important thing for the United States, given what its economy ought to be like. And in that case, therefore, that's a kind of, in my view, intermediate case between the incumbents who declined and the case of the financial sector, which is the case, I think, of an industry that became successfully predatory in its use of political action and strategic coordination, and to such an extreme degree that it was literally in the direct financial interest of many people working in the industry to destroy their firms, their personal financial incentives. If you were to look carefully at how much money they made and would have made if they had behaved differently and the industry had behaved differently, they probably made a rationally self-interested decision to do what they did, even if it ended up destroying their companies. To take the case of Jimmy Kane, for example, who ran Bear Stearns. He was chairman and CEO until January of 2008, and he was forced out as CEO in January, but remained chairman until Bear Stearns collapsed in mid-March of 2008. Over the prior decade, Kane's net worth had gone from $50 to $100 million, something like that, to about $1.5 billion. When Bear Stearns collapsed, he lost all of his current Bear Stearns stock, which took his net worth down to about $600 million. But when Bear Stearns collapsed, he was 74 years old, and so he was near retirement age anyway. He had 2 weeks before closed on the purchase of 2 fantastically expensive apartments in the Plaza Hotel. He had several other homes around the world. He, in the year prior to the collapse of Bear Stearns, and the point here, I mean, it's funny, but there's a serious point to it. his behavior indicates that in his mind, he had retired several years before. That, you know, it was convenient to still go into the office occasionally, but it does not seem that he regarded himself in any serious way as still running the company, unless his ideas about how to run a company had changed very dramatically. For a considerable fraction of the period of time immediately before Bear Stearns' collapse, he would spend 3-4 days a week playing golf at his golf club in New Jersey, where he got the golf club to give him permission to land his helicopter on the grounds, and where he also kept a house. And so he would commute by helicopter from his Manhattan headquarters to his golf club in New Jersey, and he would stay there for several days out of the week. And when he was playing golf, he would always turn his cell phone and his pager off, so he was unavailable. He had similar behavior with regard to bridge tournaments. He's a very good bridge player. He paid 2 Italian professional bridge players several $100,000s a year to tour with him playing bridge. When he was playing bridge, he would not be interrupted for office business, and he would go to bridge tournaments for, you know, like a week at a time. This is in 2007 and 2008, you know, not times when people should be spending a lot of time playing bridge if they were running an investment bank. And so that's a case where, now, do I literally believe that he decided, he made an explicit, overt calculation in his mind, I'm going to destroy my firm? No. But his incentive structure was such that the cost-benefit ratio to making sure that his firm stayed intact and that he was still going to be running it relative to helicopter golf and bridge and so on, you know, had been changed in a very, very dramatic way, and in a way that was tolerated for a remarkable period of time by his board of directors. I mean, I find it astonishing that he remained chairman of Bear Stearns until Bear Stearns collapsed, and indeed, on the day that the board met, when Bear Stearns had collapsed and had to sell itself to J.P. Morgan, initially for $2 a share, later raised to $10 a share after shareholder protests. He actually was late joining the board's conference call because he was playing bridge. And you know, that is an extraordinary kind of thing. And it turns out, and I looked into this, you know, in considerable detail for this book that I just finished, it turns out that if you looked at the conduct of the other people who were running American investment banking during much of this period, you see that there's a division between 2 classes of people, and both were quite important and prominent. And one group was similar to Mr. Kane in the sense that they'd made a lot of money, didn't care about the details, had kind of checked out, perhaps were already way over their pay grade. One probably would say that of Stan O'Neill, who ran Merrill Lynch, who also, by the way, played a lot of golf immediately before the demise of his firm. And his firm lost, in the 2 years after he was forced out, Merrill Lynch lost $80 billion, so, you know, rather consequential. Something similar would be said of Chuck Prince. And then on the other side of the ledger, you have Goldman Sachs and a half dozen very large hedge funds. There were a half dozen hedge funds that made, it's not clear exactly how much, of course they don't say, but it would appear they made somewhere between $50 and $100 billion in total between them, betting against mortgage securities, and doing this in conjunction with several investment banks, principally Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, and Morgan Stanley, but others as well. And so there was this other group that was very intelligently predatory and that came out of this, you know, more than intact. And then in the middle, there was somebody in the middle. It was Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley started betting against the securities that it was selling in 2004, but made a tactical error in doing so. And so it made a very large bet that the worst portions of these securities would fail. But they started making that bet in 2004, and the bubble went on for longer than they thought. And as a result, they had to start paying for the bet. And the way that they paid to continue making the bet was to write insurance on the security of other securities that they thought were of higher quality and therefore would not fail. And it turned out everything failed. And as a result, they lost $9 billion in 2008. But they didn't lose that money because they were charitable. They lost that money because they made a tactical mistake. So there's a spectrum of conduct that has characterized a number of American industries that goes from, I would say that what happened in the financial sector was pretty close to literal corruption, at least in some fraction of the conduct involved, to what happened, in the case of IBM, say, I think that, I don't think that anybody who was running IBM was in any way corrupt, really. I mean, they were self-interested, they were ambitious, they were political, they wanted to remain CEO or senior vice president or whatever they were. But, I don't think that any of them thought, what I'm doing is going to cause the collapse of my firm and therefore I'm going to do it anyway. I don't think any of them thought that. But they had installed around them a set of people and systems. So how did this happen? And what seemed striking about it was that in every case, it seemed that it had been a very incremental, stepwise process. A professor at Harvard who just died a few days ago, James Wilson, he had this kind of famous analogy which he used to advocate a set of policies for dealing with low-level street crime, which had to do with the importance of penalizing, sanctioning very low-level individual conduct, breaking a window, even loitering, very, very low-level things, in order to prevent a gradual deterioration of general social mores such that eventually large-scale, widespread criminal behavior would seem normal and would seem socially, okay. And what I would say is that something similar happened in these industries to varying degrees, at varying rates, with varying degrees of extremity. The way that it seems to be happening and the rate at which it seems to be happening, my sense is that it has been accelerating over the last decade, roughly. That now there's a degree of nakedness about a lot of this behavior that would have seemed unthinkable even 20 or 30 years ago. And so how did that happen? What seems again to have occurred was that at each step along the way, I think there were two processes. One was that the people engaged in the behavior had more information about it and its consequences than people who could have guarded against it, sanctioned it, prevented it, stopped it. And the other was that at each point along the way, it seemed a little more difficult, a little more painful to stop it than to just let it go. And so a very large number of individual short-term stepwise decisions eventually resulted in a large-scale institutional social change. And those kinds of processes have been studied, but they haven't been studied very much, and they've been, I would argue, they've been rather badly neglected by the economics discipline. For a variety of reasons, one being that the principal way that you study them is using a series of methodologies that are different from what most economists use. Most economists have been trained in an analytical mathematical tradition, and they emphasize equilibrium processes and general equilibrium results or partial equilibrium results and analytical mathematics, and the way that you study, at least thus far, the way these processes have been most successfully and most interestingly studied have been using agent-based models and computer simulations. And so this is books like The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod and the Epstein and Axtell book. I'm blanking on the name of the book. Two guys formerly at MIT wrote a very interesting book about social behavior using these models based on a kind of abstract society run on something they called the sugarscape. Very, very interesting book. Growing Artificial Societies is the title of the book. And the economics discipline has not wanted to use those models very much. And one reason for that, I think, has been methodological. The other reason, and so here's where maybe I'll get myself into trouble. The other reason has been that economics has been undergoing, I would argue, a similar process of gradual institutional corruption over the last 25, 30 years. And I saw it start when I was a graduate student, actually. And for a couple of months, I worked on one project that I would put, in that category. I had a summer job working for the defense of AT&T, actually, working for Peter Temin, an economics professor at MIT. He was a very nice guy and a very nice man and a good economist. But that opened my eyes, and now, a quarter century later, this is big business. If you add up the revenues of the consulting firms dedicated to mobilizing the economics discipline on behalf of large industries seeking regulatory change or safety from law enforcement or defense against antitrust suits, either private or governmental, or product liability suits, the spectrum of regulatory and legal sanctions from which they wish to be freed. This is now several $1 billion a year. The one firm, which is headquartered in Berkeley, it's now called the Berkeley Research Group. It used to be the Law and Economics Consulting Group. And when it was the Law and Economics Consulting Group, it was unusually for these companies. It was briefly a public company, and so it had to disclose its revenues. Its revenues were over $300 million a year. And there's a half dozen of these firms: Compass Lexicon, the Analysis Group, Charles River Associates, there are a number of others. And you can look at their web pages and you can see who their consultants are. And it's not the second tier. It's everybody you'd think of as important in regulatory economics, antitrust policy, et cetera. And in those domains, in regulatory economics, in industrial organization, antitrust behavior, specific industry studies, my sense is that the majority of the discipline has now been captured by these kinds of processes. And that if you look at who writes articles, who is on the editorial board of the journals, who runs the professional associations, who chairs and convenes the principal conferences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you will see that that it is no longer possible to avoid this kind of influence if you're in the economics discipline or related disciplines. It's also affected public policy and management and law and other related areas. So on that note, I will conclude. Yeah, I think I will leave it at that, and I'm sure that people will have questions and comments, and perhaps very argumentative and critical ones, which I would welcome. So.
This is uncomfortably set up, so I will try to do this. So our convention is that we have a queue which is occupied by people who are holding microphones, and the microphones will be passed out, so you get my eye, and I get the microphone to you. And, well, you can stay right there. And when you start, I would like you to make sure you announce who you are, and we'll take questions like this. So over here, do you have a question? Yeah, right here.
Thank you for...
Wait, I'm sorry. Let's start right there.
Thanks. Thank you. My name is James Williamson.
I saw the film for the first time. I saw clips of it when you gave a presentation at MIT a while back. I saw most of the film last night for the first time. Awesome film. I commend you for making it. Brings up a number of questions, and I'll make them very quick and short. First of all, I was struck by MIT, to my mind, is the preeminent economics department in the country. Larry Summers, of course, went there. Others. Andy Lowe, who was in the film, is at MIT. And yet, you mention Harvard and Columbia, but you don't mention MIT. So I wonder if you comment on that. And I know, I mean, it's no secret that you were enrolled in a program at MIT, which is great. So I was like, well, why didn't he talk about MIT? Secondly, the person, this is just a reaction that I had, which I'd be interested in your comment on. The therapist, I think he was described as a therapist who says, yes, I get these clients, and then he says, oh, I assure you that, yes, the top people. I was really put off by that, and I thought, this might not be technically a violation of that person's professional ethics, but I felt like, wow, I wouldn't want to go to a therapist who was talking like that. So I wonder, you probably didn't end up with any further business from the Wall Street crowd.
Not true, actually.
Well, interesting. And then I guess, finally, what happened off camera, if you're willing and able to talk about it, with the two characters, first of all, Glenn Hubbard, but also the person who said, I forget his name, but he said, could you turn that off for a minute?
David McCormick.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so in order, why didn't I interview people at MIT in ways similar to the interviews at Harvard and Columbia? It wasn't out of any sentiment with regard to my alma mater. In fact, I had a rather contentious private conversation with Susan Hockfield, the president of MIT, who declined to be interviewed and who, by the way, is on the board of General Electric and has been since 2007. And also, we tried to interview a very large number of people who declined to be interviewed, and several of them were MIT professors, and some of the people who declined to be interviewed are named in the film and others aren't. There's another 50 people that we tried to interview that declined to be interviewed. And then finally, it just happened that I don't know whether there's any systematic reason for this or not, but it happens to be the case that economics professors who were differentially heavily involved with the financial sector were concentrated to some extent in the institutions that are shown in the film. MIT, I think that part of that might reflect the fact that even though the economics department at MIT is very separate in some ways from the engineering side of MIT, it's nonetheless the case that the overall engineering and technical culture of MIT to some extent seeps into and affects the economics and management disciplines. That might be it, I'm not sure. So your second question, I'm sorry. Oh, the therapist, yes. He's, look, if you're going to put former madams and people whose clients are primarily, he has two groups of clients actually, Wall Street executives and women who formerly were prostitutes and working for Wall Street executives and who wish to leave. I can't say that I would want him to be my therapist, but there we are. And we feel that his information is accurate. The madam who's in the film, by the way, we very carefully edited. I did a very long interview with her, and she made a lot of allegations that were unsubstantiated and in some cases seemed to be unlikely, and which we therefore did not put in the film. But we're pretty confident that the things that she says in the film were correct. And then finally, what happened when people...
Just to clarify,
yeah.
I don't object if it's great that he's in the film, in a way. It's just, what's your view of his...
Of his professional ethics. I wouldn't say that I think his professional ethics are of the very best, but nor would I say they're of the very worst. I mean, he didn't name anybody. We did ask him for some substantiation for the things that he said, and without, I shouldn't go into details, but he provided some. He asked a number of his clients if they would be willing to speak with us, and some of them were, which was interesting too. And then what happened when David McCormick was Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs, and I've actually known him for a long time. I've known him for about 15 years, and by the way, he's actually a very decent man. He, however, had absolutely no qualifications to be where he was doing what he was in 2008. I mean, his background was, first he was in the military for 10 years. He graduated from West Point. He was in the Army for 10 years, served in the first Persian Gulf War. Then when he left the military, he was in the software industry. And he was in the software industry quite successfully. But he had no training or experience of any kind, either in finance or in financial regulation. No academic training in economics, and also very little international experience of any kind. And so, was he the right guy to be Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs? No, that would be, So he got very uncomfortable. We did turn the camera off, and we had an off-the-record conversation in which he said, look, if this is just going to be about your trying to assassinate Hank Paulson, I'm not going along for the ride, so ask me other questions. And he did, I did, and the interview continued. I'm sure he's very unhappy with the way that he was portrayed, but actually the way that he was portrayed was fair, and if anything, in some ways, an understatement. I mean, which reflected both the fact that in the interview I was rough on him, I didn't let him get away with stuff, and also the fact that, look, he had no fucking idea what was going on. He really didn't. And I asked him a series of questions about Lehman Brothers and the Barclays offer and what the FSA had done or not done with regard to it, and he had no idea. None. Zero. He hadn't been involved at all. Hank Paulson kept him totally out of the loop with regard to most of what was going on. And, it was distressing. Distressing. Sorry, long answer. I apologize.
Short question. Mark Rodwin, SAFRA Lab Fellow and Professor at Law at Suffolk University Law School. What explains the timing of this entrenchedness? Why didn't it occur earlier? Why doesn't it occur in some firms? That might give us some clues about dealing with this or changing the process. I would imagine that this is a potential problem in many countries, in many societies over time. So then what makes it happen now?
I think I have a very partial answer to that question. I would not say that I have anything remotely close to a complete answer to that question. Anybody who does, I'd like to talk to you. But I think I do have a partial one, which is that for the first roughly quarter century after World War II, the companies and industries that I named, and a number of others as well, I mean, I could say similar things about what happened to Xerox and what happened to Kodak and et cetera, in the consumer electronics industry. For roughly the first quarter century after World War II, they had something approaching a free ride. And there was very little foreign competition. Most of the rest of the world's potentially competing industrial capacity had been devastated by the war. It was, America's universe at that point. And what began to happen was that gradually other people recovered and other people began to innovate at the same time as a long period of overly easy success led them to become complacent. And then when it started to become apparent that things had to change, this is a vast oversimplification of what happened, but to, in the service of a short answer, faced with two alternatives, one being drastic, painful internal reform, and in some cases, leaders losing their jobs. Choice A. Choice B, starting to use money to paper over the problem in various ways. It turned out that using money to paper over the problem was stunningly, frighteningly easy, and that American society, or the relevant portions of American society and American institutions, had not been set up to guard against this kind of thing if it started to happen on a large scale. And you can look at many different indicators, and you see that many indicators begin changing around the same time. This is the late 1970s, early 1980s. You see the beginnings of the deregulatory movement, particularly in financial services, but also in other industries. You see a sharp escalation in the pay, the cash pay, given to members of boards of directors. You see a very sharp escalation of political donations, campaign donations. You see a sharp escalation in lobbying hiring. If you count the number of lobbying firms and law firms in Washington, D.C., the number of people employed as lobbyists. You see a sharp change in the ratio of public sector to private sector compensation. There are many, many indicators that suggest that when the American industrial system started to come under stress, that the response of the incumbents was this kind of response.
My name's Dennis Thompson. I'm former director, entrenched director of the Safra Center. First of all, thank you for the talk, but thank you even more for the wonderful film. One of its effects has been to cause the economics profession, or the AEA, to adopt a code of ethics for the first time. And it is, I don't have to imagine, I mean, your film was cited by the economists who brought the greatest pressure to bear on the association. Some 300 of them, that's a frightening image, isn't it? 300 economists. I'd say the same about philosophers as well. But a group of 300 economists asked, and it happened now, as you know. Now, the problem is that it is one of the weakest professional codes. Even this, I should say, the sociologists have a stronger one. The reason it's weak is that it's all about disclosure. It's only disclosure, and it's limited to the 5 journals that the association has, although it urges economists to disclose more. That's not the major problem, though, as it's become a standard view around here and in the ethics world to say disclosure is not enough. And I would add, it actually can be counterproductive if it's that's all that's done. I mean, in fact, if we get a lot of disclosure as a result of this code, what we will do is have less confidence in the economic profession than we had before. Now, maybe maybe we should have less confidence, but nonetheless, that's part of the aim of trying to get rid of institutional corruption, is to build confidence in the profession or the institution, and this won't. So if disclosure is going to work, and if this new code is going to work, we need, I think, and I suspect you think, more than disclosure. We need to do things as, say, the medical profession has done. So what would you urge the profession to add to their code that they don't now have? And would you make a film about it?
I'm not going to make a film about it. As a matter of fact, the next film that I hope to make, well, I've been hired to make that a film that doesn't count. But the next film that I want to make on my own volition has absolutely zero political content of any kind, and so I think I kind of need a break. But I agree with your comments very much. And in fact, if you look around the world at relevant, similar, comparable professions, not just academic, but if you look at the way journalistic organizations treat potential conflicts of interest, the New York Times doesn't let people accept any money from the industries they cover or the people they cover. And I think that something similar, maybe not quite that stringent, but something similar would be a good idea. And some universities have adopted that. Stanford actually has been very good in this regard, much better than most other universities, and I've been very gratified to see that. But so far, you're absolutely correct. There have been many responses to the film, and many university departments and professors have responded to the film in ways that I've found quite gratifying. But thus far, the only thing that has actually been done is disclosure requirements, and I agree with you that they are certainly not adequate. I don't think that I would say that they're worse than nothing, but I would agree that they're vastly inadequate, particularly given the scale of the problem at the moment.
My name is Abby Brown. I'm a fellow at the Safra Center, and I'm studying auditors and financial fraud from the perspective of the audit profession, which is completely relevant to your work. And I'm curious, I'm working on a chapter now on Lehman Brothers and their accounting leading up to their downfall. And I'm wondering if you have any sense, if we had known the leverage and the problems that Lehman was having with its assets leading up to the crisis, up to its bankruptcy, would that have changed people's ability to respond to what was going on, or would it have simply started the financial crisis 6 months or a year earlier? Do you have any sense of what that counterfactual would be?
Well, I think the answer to your question depends on two things. One is, at what point in time would information have become known? Unfortunately, though, I think the more important question is, who's we? What happened, if you're studying Lehman and its auditors, then do you know about the Matthew Lee letter? Okay, so for those who don't know, a quite senior guy at Lehman, Matthew Lee, he was a senior vice president. He was in charge of Lehman's global balance sheet. And in June of 2008, he wrote a letter which he hand-delivered to 4 senior Lehman executives, including the chief financial officer, which said, there's like tens of billions of dollars of stuff here that, you can't justify. And he said in the letter, I feel that it is my ethical and legal obligation to point this out. Well, by June of 2008, I don't think that Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson kind of had too many excuses for not paying attention to a letter like that and not knowing about it. Why didn't they? I don't know. One thing that's mystifying is that they have said, and of course, both of them personally declined to be interviewed for the film and even to speak with me off the record, but I've spoken to many people who are at Treasury, many people who are in the Fed, many people who study these questions, and there's a fairly substantial documentary record now, which you probably have been looking at. And they said at the time, and they said later, that they had full-time personnel monitoring these firms, working full-time in these firms during this period. But it's also, they have said, and it also seems to be true, actually, that they did not, in all of the cases where a major institution failed, Lehman, Merrill, AIG, WAMU, Wachovia, Citigroup, in no case, it appears, did they have more than about 2 or 3 days notice that the organic matter was about to hit the fan. Bear Stearns, same thing. They really seem not to have understood until the very moment before. How can that be? That's a really good question. I don't know. Tell me, what do you think?
Well, I mean, some of your movie brought out the fact that the gaming out the bankruptcy of Lehman would have helped stop that heart attack moment in the financial crisis system. And it seems that if they had known, because Lehman was...
Jenny, can you just...
Sorry.
Lehman was in trouble for at least a year before
Yep.
it went bankrupt, and with its Repo 105 deal. Sorry to get into the inside baseball, but if they had not been allowed to hide the leverage that they were in, you would have seen them sort of skating off that slope in slow motion, and perhaps you could have had a more preparation. Although I don't know what good that would have done.
I completely agree with you. The mystery is why
Yeah.
none of that was understood and why nothing was done, and I don't know the answer. And
Yeah.
and if, by the way, you certainly aren't going to understand the answer by reading Hank Paulson's memoir. That's for sure.
Jenny?
Just had a question about.
Your name is Jenny?
Oh, Jenny Pham Cantor. I'm a fellow at the Safra Lab. Question about your claim of regulatory capture of the economics profession. I was wondering if you could have a response to the argument that maybe you are overstating the degree of capture for a couple of reasons. One is that it seems like a lot of the economists who are consultants in this way are applied microeconomists or people in finance, which, contrary to popular belief, is actually a pretty small part of the profession. A lot of them do pretty obscure theoretical things, and they're not, I guarantee you, getting any money. And the second is, even the ones who are listed, in the annual reports of these big consulting firms, my understanding is some of them play a pretty cursory role. They sort of agree to be listed, and maybe they get some nominal amount of money, but they're not really doing anything for these firms except perhaps giving them status or prestige.
There's a considerable amount of truth to both of the comments that you make. I don't think, however, that they very much change my view or the fact, the reality of the situation, because if you're in the discipline, yourself, economics is in fact these days rather specialized and rather siloed, and so if you are looking for somebody to help you in congressional testimony, or and by the way, people are very frequently these days paid for congressional testimony. For congressional testimony or an SEC, regulatory proceeding or something like that, then you're probably not going to go to somebody who's a labor economist or somebody who studies poverty or somebody who studies the telecommunications industry. Or, you're going to go to somebody who's recognized in some relevant area. There are some people who have worked successfully in more than one area. But there's a fair amount of specialization. And if you look at the people in the relevant specialty areas, the ones that I mentioned, for example, individual industry studies, regulation, industrial organization, finance, then you see a remarkable concentration of not cursory behavior. And just to make the point, many people, of course, do have just a cursory relationship, but where do all those revenues come from? I mean, this is literally several $1 billion a year. Someone's paying that for some reason, and it's going somewhere, So, no, and unfortunately, and my own personal experience, the one industry issue where actually there were two. One was software that I was personally deeply involved in. The other was telecommunications. And in the telecommunications case, I delved very deep at one point. I haven't done that recently. My recent knowledge is more superficial relative to what I did, now 15 years ago. But when I did this roughly 15 years ago or 12 years ago or something, when I was done writing that book, I knew a lot. And I had long private conversations with people in the antitrust division, including with Joel Klein, who was then the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, and also with the chief economist at the time, Tim Bresnahan. And they told me very directly, look, there's 100 of these guys, and not a single one will testify on behalf of the government if we bring a case. Not a single one. So, unfortunately, I think that now, if there were to be a mass movement of the entire economics profession to try and change the situation in these several sub-disciplines, you might be right that the people who are deeply involved in this problem would be a numerical minority. But they would not be a financial minority, and they would not be a minority in terms of influence in their universities. at all.
Mr. Ferguson, my name is Arnold Reisman. I'm a retired professor of medicine and social medicine here at Harvard, and for many years before that, I was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. First of all, let me tell you that I thought your film was very powerful and very persuasive. I saw it several months ago, and it left an enormous impression on me. I think you should know, I suspect you do know, that your description of the corruption in the academic halls of economics pales in scale before the corruption of the medical care profession that is caused by the conflicts of interest there. About 30 years ago, medicine began to think of itself for the first time as an industry. And that change in attitude has had an enormous effect on the American healthcare system. I know you have other plans for other films, but that's a wonderful area that ought to be explored. In scale, it's enormous, and it just doesn't concern money. It concerns life and health and the public welfare in a way that the financial industry doesn't.
I thank you very much for your comment. For your information, and we'll see what comes of it. It has yet to receive distribution, but I was on the jury of the Sundance Film Festival this past year, a couple months ago. And so in 8 days, I watched 19 documentaries, which was a great experience, actually. One of them is a film that has just been made called Escape Fire. And it's largely about what you just described. And there's some very strong stuff in it. I tried to help with its distribution. It still has not gotten distributed, but the people with whom I've spoken are optimistic that it will get distributed. Two, relatively obscure filmmakers. I honestly, at the moment, cannot remember their names. They are represented by CAA, but if you want, I can communicate, who they are. And they interview a number of quite prominent people, and they talk about a number of quite striking recent examples.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Schkabeter. I'm a fellow at the Lab Center. You discuss corruption in the financial industry, corruption in the academia. I'm wondering to what extent you have encountered evidence of corruption in the entertainment industry and in the media while making the film or after its release.
Who could think that there was ever a problem in the entertainment sector? Actually, I have to say, I've been very pleasantly surprised thus far by my experiences in the movie industry. There are a number of, for anybody who's in the industry, and even for people who are not, there are a number of truly classic books and also films about gigantic, horrific movie-making disasters of various kinds caused by various different things. Anybody who wants to do a lot of laughing at black comedy, John Gregory Dunn's The Studio. Daryl Zanuck, who was then the chairman of 20th Century Fox in 1966 or something like that, made a really big mistake, which was that he gave John Gregory Dunn the run of Fox for a year. And the result was this book. And just read the first page. It's all you have to read. And the first page is his describing an episode in the conduct of Daryl Zanuck, the man who gave him that access. And I don't think that those two gentlemen ever met again afterwards. But anyway, my own experience actually has been very good. And so, with regard to the distribution of my film was partially financed by and was distributed by Sony Classics, which is the quote-unquote independent arm of Sony Pictures. It's run by two guys, Michael Barker and Tom Bernard, who've been running it for 20 years. And they are, they're tough with the dollar. We had some pretty rough exchanges about division of revenues and costs and things like that. But, I would not like to be somebody trying to intimidate Tom Bernard. And they were great, They were great. Never once, they gave me contractual final cut, they gave me real final cut, and never once did they say, could you tone it down a little bit? This guy's, on our board, or this guy's our neighbor, or, not once. They were fantastic. And they campaigned to get me an Academy Award, and they fucking got me one, So, no complaints there.
Steve Helfer, Harvard Law School Library, retired. You pointed a very clear, or apparently clear, picture of corruption in academia, pretty much in the economics profession. And I think it's Dr. Relman seemed to indicate there's a lot of corruption up at the medical school, too.
Not seen, sir, is.
Okay, got it, thank you. My question then would be, if the academics are so easily corruptible, why should we then look to them to regulate? I mean, who's going to regulate the regulators? Money is not the only thing that corrupts. Power corrupts, we've seen in history, far more than money. The power to change societies and the visionaries who kill millions of people to do this. So why should we look to academia to regulate society? Thank you.
Well, very good question. But in principle, these are the people who know the subject. They're not the only people who know the subject, but they're among the principal people who know the subject and know the subject the best. And but I think that in a very real sense, you're right that there's a major problem now, because this process in academia and in other relevant domains, I would say that journalism has been largely, though not completely, spared of this process, at least up to this point. But in a number of important institutional arenas in the United States, this process has gone far enough that now it is starting to get difficult to find a large enough number of sufficiently senior, sufficiently experienced people who can, help run the country. And, that's a worrisome situation, I think. But at the same time, there's a lot of smart people in the United States, and there are also a number of very good economists and very prominent economists who've spoken out in a great way about these issues. Raghu Rajan, the University of Chicago, wrote this brilliant paper in 2005, and he's a very prominent guy. For a while, he was chief economist of the IMF, and he's an advisor to the Prime Minister of India, and Nuri Rubini, and so it's not like there's nobody. There's plenty of people who are still on the right side.
I'm Frances Kam. I'm a professor of philosophy and connected with the Safra Center. I just wanted to say one thing. I think one way you could make the argument from the Wilson reference to Professor Wilson's work even stronger is that when Wilson applied his argument to street-level crime, right, many people might think that there's something morally problematic about persistently arresting, poor people or, so-called underprivileged, in quotes, right, people who are committing small crimes, simply because this is a means to averting the, bigger crimes down the road. And even though it might be efficient, right, somebody may say, there is something morally problematic about doing that, okay? Because you wouldn't otherwise focus on them so scrutinizingly if it weren't the fact that they led to bigger fish, and, there are problems with using people in this way, perhaps. But especially people who have backgrounds that are, deficient in many ways. But so the problem somebody might have with applying Wilson's strategy to the crime situation that he applied it to, wouldn't necessarily have it with respect to applying it in the financial world, all right? Namely, strictly scrutinizing every little thing that goes wrong, or it seems to be an incipient, laziness or corruption, okay? So I just want to point out that even if people reject the application, let's say for moral reasons, such as I was hinting at, right, of Wilson's thesis in his area, it wouldn't necessarily apply in your area, the thing that you're concerned with. But one of the things I was concerned about is that this problem about stopping it, nipping it in the bud, right, and the time and attention it will take to do that. Is that a feasible solution to this sort of a problem? I mean, should you make it the case that people are uncertain whether they will be caught and therefore liable to, be better? Or do you really want to increase the number of regulators who look after all the incipient small corruptions or so forth? Or do you want to build in some sort of more internal monitoring? I'm not sure how it will work, applying the Wilsonian strategy. Because you mentioned one of the things was that regulators didn't have the information that the insiders had, right? In the Madoff case, right, they seemed to have all the information they needed, and they just never moved, right? And of course, that wasn't the case where it was just merely incipient small stuff. But so I'm just wondering how applying the Wilsonian strategy in this area, how you see it playing out. That was one of my questions.
It's a very tough question, and I don't have a terribly good answer, I have to say. I will say also several things here. One is that unfortunately there actually is an analogous moral issue in considering prosecutions in the financial sector. I've had several very long conversations with people about this. One very long conversation that I had, which unfortunately couldn't make it into the film, was with Eliot Spitzer about why he didn't prosecute anybody when he was bringing his cases when he was New York Attorney General. And his response was, we could have easily gotten convictions for low-level people, but the definitive proof is down here, whereas the real culpability is up here. And so he felt that it would be unfair to go after the low-level people, nail them, but not go after the high-level people because there wasn't a sufficient evidentiary record. Now, well, the answer in the case of the financial crisis, well, I'm tempted to give like a 45-minute long answer, which I should not do. Read my book. There's seriously 100 pages about these questions in the book. We now have enough of an evidentiary record to know that quite high-level people in these firms knew what was going on. There is a divide at the very top management level. There's a divide between the groups of firms that I mentioned. There was one class of firms where, again, vastly oversimplifying, top management was was greedy, but clueless. And then there was another class of firms where they knew perfectly well what they were doing. And there's also enough of an evidentiary record for us to know that in many cases, very senior people were deeply involved in what was going on, and that they are criminally liable. And I go through this in very great detail in the book. If you look at the range of statutes that could be applied, all these guys engaged in accounting fraud. All these guys certified financial statements and certified the existence of adequate financial controls when the reverse was true. And in many cases, there's strong evidence from what we know already that they knew that. And the Matthew Lee letter, for example, was sent to the CFO of Lehman, who was one of the two people who has to sign their Sarbanes-Oxley certifications. And there are other things too. These people committed perjury, they committed accounting fraud, they made representations in their securities which were false. So one huge, very disturbing fact about this whole situation is the complete absence of criminal prosecutions. And because it's not that they didn't commit crimes, and it's not that we couldn't prove it. It's for other reasons.
So we're coming close to the end. Eric?
Yes, I'm Eric Beerbaum, Director of the Graduate Fellowships in the Software Center and a member of the Department of Government. And I wanted to ask you about the moment, the, I guess, infamous interview with Glenn Hubbard, who was, and I think now is, still Dean of Business at Columbia.
Yes, he is.
And he gets very worked up when you ask him to possibly disclose some of the corporations he's consulting for. But when you catch him fabricating on his own CV a title, altering a title of the article about Iceland, if I recall.
But that was another professor.
That was another professor.
Yeah, that was Frederick Mishkin. But yes.
Okay, right. So, but in the Mishkin case, right, there was a bit of a coyness to his response. It was an accident to alter the valence of this article. Whereas I take that, it's a pretty, maybe it's a low level, but it's a utterly clear violation of academic integrity. And so I'm curious a little more about the color on that interview in its larger context. Did he view this as a little, a little peccadillo, or did he realize that how could this possibly be an accident? And that just sets up the larger question of, it seemed like business schools didn't get the same attention that I would have expected in comparison to Department of Economics. And I wonder if you could say a little more about that attention, slightly selective, of the film.
Well, I thought, Columbia Business School certainly got some attention in the film. And, neither Glenn Hubbard nor Frederick Mishkin, needless to say, was very happy at the end of those interviews. So I think that they got their due. To some extent, there is a differential focus on, if not on economics departments, at least on the economics discipline, because it was principally the economics discipline that was and is the economics discipline that's been involved in the defense promulgation of deregulatory policy. And also these people have held very high government positions in which they pursued those policies and furthered those policies, et cetera. It's also where the conflicts of interest are, how would I put it, most concealed, most unobvious, most startling, shall we say. If somebody's in a business school, they can be forgiven for, in some sense, advocating the cause of business because, it's kind of what they do. They train people to go into business. Especially if their specialty is management or organizational behavior or marketing or something of that sort. But if you're an economist and if you're writing about the economic principles underlying the proper level of regulation of the financial services industry, then that's different. And so I did focus in part for that reason. With regard to Mishkin lied. He just flat out lied. And which I know because he said, first he said in the interview, oh, it's a typo. Then later, in an article in the Financial Times, he claimed that it was an earlier mistake which he had corrected months before. I had downloaded his CV from his website that morning. So I don't think so. A friend of mine who is an economist, who was at a very high level in the world, I will not identify him by saying exactly where, but very high level, said to me after you watched the film, in the case of Mishkin, frankly, I thank God that he resigned from the Federal Reserve in August of 2008. The last thing we would have wanted was him actually making decisions in the Federal Reserve once Lehman failed. And I very much have that sense about Mishkin is, somehow this is a guy who has been over his pay grade for the last 25 years, But that's not true of most of the other people. It's not true of Glenn Hubbard. The majority situation is not the kind of cluelessness that you see in Mishkin and that interview. Glenn Hubbard knows exactly what he's about, and so do the other guys.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Ferguson. My name is David Korn. I'm a professor of pathology at Harvard Medical School. One of the things that intrigued me the most about your movie, and I think my wife and I saw it the weekend it opened in Kendall Square, was the idea, the indignation of so many of the eminent economists that you were interviewing, an indignation that you could possibly think that their consulting activities could possibly influence the advice they were giving to the government. It reminded me very much, not in the apocalyptic way that my colleague Bud Relman sees it, but nonetheless, of doctors who are very indignant if you tell them that the pharmaceutical blandishments that they get have any influence on their treatment options or prescribing options. Now with the doctors, and they really are indignant. I mean, they regard the allegation as something that's just impossible, couldn't happen. But the economists practice a discipline that's founded on the axiom that financial stimuli and motivations do influence human behavior. And I was wondering whether this elite group that you interviewed regard themselves as immune or perhaps evolutionarily a different species.
I did ask several of them exactly that question, including John Campbell, who's here. You know, that I didn't put that into the film, but they all got pretty uncomfortable when we entered into a very direct discussion of that question. And Campbell's defense was, well, you know, okay, so we might be self-interested, but in the first place, there are checks and balances in the form of, you know, anonymous peer review and so forth. And in the second place, it's in our self-interest to be seen as credible, and we would lose our reputations if we corrupted ourselves, which just turns out not to be true. You know, if it turns out that, and his argument, the argument that several others made in a very similar way was, you know, look, if we're Nouriel Roubini and we correctly call the coming of the crisis, then as soon as we are known to have been able to do that, then we become rock stars and we're famous, and so the incentives go towards being accurate and truthful. It turns out that that just isn't true. You know, in the first place, it's sometimes hard to be correct, and in the second place, hard in the sense of, you know, it takes a lot of hard work, and you have to monitor things, and you have to know your stuff, and be prepared to go against the congressional wisdom. You know, that's a Freudian slip. The obviously conventional wisdom. You know, Nouriel Roubini kind of labored in the dark for 2 years before anybody paid attention to him when he was talking about these things. And same thing with Rajan, you know, very eminent guy, chief economist of the IMF when he delivers his paper in 2005, and nobody wanted to hear what he was saying, like nobody. And it turns out that if you want to be on the board of AIG and just kick back, or on the board of Morgan Stanley pays Laura Tyson $350,000 a year to go to 4 meetings. You know, it's not a bad gig. She's on 4 boards. She makes $908,000 a year being on 4 boards. She just resigned from one, Kodak. When Kodak went bankrupt, she resigned from Kodak. So
last question, Susan.
Susan Silby, I'm professor at MIT, just to make full disclosure. I said I teach at MIT, just bond with our speaker. I would like to offer an observation that I'm the last one to want to defend the economists, okay? But I don't think we're fair to them in thinking that it's the dollar sign alone. And I wonder if we're undermining something much more powerful, which I think about maybe an easy way to characterize it if you remember Wittgenstein's little drawing of the duck and the rabbit. They can't see the duck because they always see the rabbit. And the reason why they see the rabbit, that is, they don't see systemic risk because they're all products of a particular economic philosophy. And the time frame that you gave for these radical changes, these coalescing of indicators, was the triumph of a particular theory that democracy and capitalism, freedom and capital, unfettered capital, were what would make a better world. And that philosophy had been promoted. It was in the dark and not believed for a long time when Hayek first started writing, but Keynes was prominent. And then in the 60s, Friedman and Hayek get to do their bit. And they get to do it by offering an alternative to the Soviet Union, capital and freedom. They are exactly meshed. These guys believe they are doing the right thing. They can't see it some other way. And I say that because I happen to teach an interdisciplinary course, which is taught by an economist, an international business guy, and me, the left-wing sociologist. And I hear them. They really can't see what they're saying most of the time because they see the duck all the time. And so if you think about finance, why it's different than the failures of General Motors or of IBM, because when General Motors has to make a car or a truck, and when the car or the truck doesn't run, they at least have some evidence of failure, not only financial failure. And so they have a criteria of a good product as well as a good company, you know. But finance has nothing but making money. And the criteria of whether you're doing right is only defined by the boundary of the law. There's nothing that tells you what's right and wrong about finance except something external. And their philosophy took it away. It's illegitimate. The market should be free. So I think it's not that money corrupts them, it's their whole philosophy. It's the way they believe, wrongly, that the market must work. And that's why they're easily corrupted. That's my philosophy.
I think that there's much to what you say. I think that there's a very complicated relationship between individual psychology, professional culture, and also financial incentives. And, you know, they affect each other, and people get cognitive dissonance after they've done one thing. And, you know, I will say that, you know, I've encountered a number of circumstances where it seems pretty clear that people didn't have, you know, sincere philosophical, you know, when somebody's paid $250,000 a year, excuse me, paid $250,000 for 1 hour of congressional testimony, in which their sole purpose is to defend the taxation of hedge fund carried interest as capital gains income. You know, I don't think there's too much philosophy in that, and you see, you know, I'm sorry. I don't think, you know, and there have been a number of cases. You know, there was in the Microsoft case, Microsoft's principal economic witness was caught contradicting his own academic writing on the witness stand. And there are a number of cases where, you know, I think it's really pretty clear what's going on. But I think you're right that there is also this very important cultural, philosophical element, and the two have, you know, kind of combined over time in this very complicated way.
So I've never allowed this to go over. It's the corruption that you've had an effect on me. But thank you very much for the time and for this.
Thank you.